It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when a small courtroom in a quiet town became the setting for a story that would ripple through the lives of many. The wooden doors creaked open, and a woman stepped into the room with the kind of presence that could silence a crowd. Her name was Dr. Clara Washington, and despite her modest attire, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades building a legacy in her field. But that morning she wasn't here as the respected anthropologist everyone knew her to be. She was here because of a seemingly trivial misunderstanding that would quickly spiral into something much, much bigger. The room fell silent as the judge, a stern man in his 50s named Judge Thomas Rowe, looked up from his papers. He was a man of principles, or at least that's how he liked to see himself. A man who believed in the rule of law above all else, with little patience for those who seemed to break the rules, regardless of the circumstances. His eyes scanned the paperwork before him, taking in the details of the woman standing before him. "Dr. Washington," he began, his voice low but firm, "you are being fined for a violation that, frankly, should not have occurred. Your actions were disruptive, and you have caused unnecessary chaos in this courthouse. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Clara's gaze was steady, but inside, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been called to the courthouse for a routine appearance, and what should have been a simple matter had turned into an all-out confrontation. She wasn't someone who sought confrontation, but sometimes the truth had a way of drawing lines that others weren't willing to cross. "I am not guilty of the charges you are referring to," Clara said, her voice calm, controlled. "What happened here was a misunderstanding. There was no chaos, only a need for clarity. But it seems that isn't what's being acknowledged today." Judge Rowe, clearly unamused, glanced down at his notes, flipping through pages as if seeking some form of justification. He had dealt with people like Clara before, those who were clever, articulate, and capable of weaving a story that might sway public opinion. He wasn't one to be fooled by words. He had dealt with complicated cases, with witnesses who thought they could manipulate the truth with their charm and education. But this time, something felt different. Clara wasn't just any woman. There was a history behind her, one that wasn't immediately visible, one that threatened to turn this case into something much more complex. "You claim there was no destruction, yet the staff present recall a scene that could only be described as disorderly. You made demands that were unreasonable for a situation that should have been handled with more civility." Judge Rowe continued, eyes narrowing. "And now, I must ask, why should you not be fined for your actions?" Clara stood tall, her mind racing through a lifetime of research, studies, and experiences that made her far more than the woman standing before this man in this small courtroom. She was a force to be reckoned with in her field, a renowned anthropologist whose work had led to groundbreaking discoveries about ancient civilizations. Her knowledge had earned her respect from academics, politicians, and even world leaders. But in this courtroom, none of that mattered. Here she was just another defendant, facing a judge who had no idea who he was dealing with. "Your Honor," Clara began, her tone soft but unwavering, "I'm an anthropologist, not a troublemaker. The situation you're referring to was a misunderstanding, but it's clear to me that what's really happening here is something far more complicated. You're not just judging my actions, you're passing judgment on the person standing in front of you." Judge Rowe paused, his brow furrowing as he studied her more closely. He had heard of Clara Washington, of course. Her name had been mentioned in academic circles, but he had never really paid much attention to the stories surrounding her work. To him, she was just another figure who had stepped into his courtroom. But there was something in her eyes, something that told him this wasn't going to be an easy case. Maybe it was the way she stood, poised, like a woman who knew her worth. Or perhaps it was the way her words carried weight, even without trying to impress anyone. Clara knew the truth was on her side, but the law was a tricky thing. It didn't care about context or history. It only cared about the facts, and that's what she had to face. Still, she couldn't help but wonder how many people had been judged before her without ever having the chance to truly speak their truth. How many had been silenced because they didn't have the voice to stand up in a room like this? "Let me be clear," Clara continued, her voice now firm and unwavering. "I may not be a lawyer, but I understand the importance of rules. But I also understand the importance of questioning those rules when they fail to see the bigger picture. I came to this courthouse as a professional, but what happened here was not about professionalism. It was about something deeper." The room was still, the tension thick enough to cut through. The other people present, clerks, bailiffs, and spectators, watched with bated breath, unsure of what would happen next. They had seen judges hand down fines for much less, but they had never seen a defendant challenge a judge so directly. The air seemed to hum with the weight of unspoken words. Judge Rowe cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I have heard enough. The law is clear, Dr. Washington. You are being fined for your actions, and that's final." But Clara wasn't done. She stepped forward, her voice now ringing with a quiet power that commanded attention. "You don't know who I am, do you, Judge Rowe? You don't understand the significance of what you're doing. I didn't just walk into this courtroom as a woman who's been caught in a misunderstanding. I came here as someone who's spent her life uncovering the truth. And you, of all people, should understand that the truth isn't always what it seems on the surface." There was a moment of silence, a beat of tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Judge Rowe's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. His eyes flicked toward Clara, then back to his notes, as if trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the version of her he had built in his mind. But Clara wasn't going to let him off that easily. "You're about to make a decision that could change your entire understanding of who I am, and who you are as well. And I'm asking you, Judge, to reconsider, because there's more to this story than you realize." The judge hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly on the wooden surface before him. He could feel the weight of Clara's words, the hidden depth that lay just beneath the surface of their exchange. But as a judge, his duty was clear: to uphold the law and pass judgment impartially. He couldn't afford to be swayed by personal emotions or respect for someone's past. Clara could see the struggle in his eyes, and for the briefest of moments, she felt something shift within her. This wasn't just about the fine, or even the misunderstanding. It was about something larger, something that could shake the foundations of the very system that had brought her here in the first place. "I suggest you think carefully, Judge Rowe," she said, her voice low but carrying a quiet intensity. "Because what you decide today could have consequences far beyond this courtroom, and you won't be able to undo it once the truth comes out." The judge's expression hardened once more, his decision seemingly made, but the doubt that had crept into his mind lingered, making the air in the room thick with the weight of what was yet to come. As the gavel came down, sealing the decision, Clara knew this was just the beginning. The truth she was about to reveal would change everything. But would the judge be ready to face it? Or had she just set into motion something much larger than either of them could have ever anticipated? And so the story was just beginning. What would happen next? Would Clara's legacy survive the weight of this encounter, or would the consequences of this courtroom clash echo far beyond the walls of this small town? Only time would tell. The gavel struck the wooden block with a sharp, resounding thud. The courtroom, which had been holding its breath, exhaled collectively, as if relieved that the moment of tension had finally passed. Clara didn't move, her gaze fixed on the judge as if daring him to look up from his papers and meet her eyes. She could feel the heat of the room, the eyes of the spectators, the unspoken judgment. But inside her, the fire that had been building during the whole exchange had only grown. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Judge Rowe's eyes flicked briefly toward her, his lips pressing into a tight line, but he didn't speak immediately. He stood there for a moment, adjusting his glasses and looking at the paper before him. It wasn't the decision she had hoped for, but it was far from the end. Clara could feel the shift inside her, the realization that this was a game of patience, and she wasn't the one who needed to rush. The court began to adjourn, but Clara remained in her seat, watching as people filed out. The murmur of voices grew louder, the whispers growing in volume as they reached her ears. Some were curious, others judgmental, all of them unaware of the woman they were gossiping about. She could hear fragments of conversation. "She's just a woman. How could she speak like that? And I've heard of her, but she doesn't seem like the type who would cause trouble." Clara stood and walked slowly toward the exit, her heels clicking on the polished wood floor. She could feel the weight of the conversations behind her, the sting of their ignorance. They had no idea who she was or what she had done. No one in this room seemed to understand the significance of her work, of the many years she had spent uncovering the forgotten truths of humanity. But to them, she was just another defendant, a woman in trouble with the law. As she made her way down the hallway, she could hear footsteps approaching behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the court staff, but it was a familiar face, Detective James Harlow. His eyes were narrow, his face set in a neutral expression, but there was an unmistakable wariness in his posture. "Dr. Washington." He greeted her with a slight nod, though his tone was anything but friendly. "I didn't expect to see you here today." Clara gave him a tight smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't expect to be here either. But it seems fate has its own plans." Harlow's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. "You're a hard one to pin down, you know that?" His voice was low, almost teasing, but there was a definite edge to it. "I've read about your work. I've even seen you speak at a couple of conferences. Never thought I'd be seeing you in a place like this." Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her mind. Harlow was no stranger to her field. He was a detective with a reputation for digging deeper than most, though his interest in anthropology had always seemed more like a hobby than a profession. Still, she wasn't one to make assumptions. She had learned long ago that people were not always what they seemed. "Sometimes," she said slowly, her voice calm, "the world has a way of bringing people together, even when they least expect it. You never know who you might run into in a place like this." Harlow smirked, but his eyes didn't quite match his smile. "I suppose that's one way to look at it. But if you ask me, it looks like you've gotten yourself into a bit of a mess. Care to explain what happened in that courtroom? I've never seen a judge so determined to hand down a fine, no matter how much someone tried to argue." Clara folded her arms across her chest, her gaze drifting toward the exit doors. She wasn't in the mood for a conversation, but she knew better than to dismiss Harlow so easily. If there was anyone who might understand the complexity of her situation, it was him. Still, she wasn't about to give him anything too easy. "I've been in trouble before," she said quietly. "It's part of the job. People don't always like the truths I uncover. But today was different. It wasn't about the fine. It was about something much bigger." Harlow's interest seemed to peak. "Bigger how?" Clara hesitated for a moment, then turned back to him. "There's a lot you don't know about me, detective. A lot you couldn't possibly understand. But I can tell you this much. What happened today wasn't just a courtroom misunderstanding. It was a message." "A message?" Harlow repeated, his brow furrowing. "From who?" "From those who don't want people like me uncovering the truth," Clara said quietly. "From those who want to keep the past buried, no matter the cost." Harlow didn't say anything at first, his expression unreadable. But Clara could see the flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, suspicion, perhaps even disbelief. He was trying to make sense of her words, to figure out if she was just another eccentric academic, or if there was something more to her than she was letting on. "You think someone's targeting you?" he asked after a long pause. Clara nodded slowly. "Not just me. Anyone who gets too close to the truth. But the real question is, why now? Why this case? I don't think it's just a coincidence that I'm standing here, facing a fine for something as trivial as an argument. I think I'm being sent a message." Harlow's gaze shifted, and for the first time, Clara saw the faintest hint of concern in his eyes. "You need to be careful, Dr. Washington. People who go looking for secrets often find things they're not ready to see." "I'd spent my life looking for things people aren't ready to see," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm not going to stop now." As she turned to leave, Harlow called after her, his voice tinged with something between warning and curiosity. "If you need help, you know where to find me." Clara didn't answer. She simply walked out of the courthouse, the sound of her heels echoing through the empty hallway. Outside, the sky was overcast, the air thick with the promise of rain. But Clara didn't notice the weather. Her mind was already racing, the events of the morning playing out in her head. She had been fine. She had been perfectly calm and collected. But now that she was alone, she could feel the tension start to build again. The message had been clear. Someone was watching her. And whoever it was had no intention of letting her uncover whatever it was she was getting too close to. She didn't know who was behind it. She didn't know what they wanted. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. But as she walked down the street, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She couldn't shake the nagging thought that someone was waiting for her, watching her every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And as much as she wanted to ignore it, she knew that whatever was coming next would be far worse than anything she had faced before. Clara's footsteps slowed as she reached the end of the courthouse steps. The weight of the morning's events felt heavier than she anticipated. The tension in her shoulders, the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach. It was all becoming too real. She had never been one to shy away from conflict, but this was different. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or a trivial case of someone overreacting. There was something much deeper at play, something far more dangerous than she could have imagined when she first walked into that courtroom. The cool air hit her face as she stepped onto the sidewalk, but it did little to clear her head. Clara's mind was still spinning. The fine, the judge's dismissive attitude, the subtle threat hidden beneath his words. It all felt like a carefully orchestrated trap. But by who? And why? She had dedicated her life to anthropology, piecing together the stories of ancient civilizations, uncovering the truths buried in the past. She had spent years studying human history, tracking patterns in the bones of the long dead. Yet now she felt like she was standing on the edge of a mystery that threatened to consume her. As she walked down the street, her thoughts shifted. Who was behind this? She thought about her colleagues, her peers in academia. Could one of them have orchestrated this? A rival, perhaps. Someone who resented her groundbreaking work, her success in uncovering long-forgotten secrets. It was possible, but it didn't feel right. She had made enemies in her field, sure, but none of them had the resources or the power to pull something like this off. No, this was bigger. Much bigger. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, cutting through her thoughts. Clara pulled it out, expecting it to be a simple text or call. Instead, it was an email, one that she hadn't seen in years. The name on the screen made her stop in her tracks. Dr. Benjamin Lyle. He was an old colleague, someone she had once trusted. They had worked together on a major dig years ago, an excavation that had uncovered an ancient civilization buried deep beneath the sands of North Africa. The discovery had made headlines, had changed the way people thought about ancient human history. But shortly after that dig, Lyle had become distant. Their professional relationship had soured over a disagreement about the direction of their research. She had pushed for more open, honest approaches, while he had been more interested in the fame and prestige that came with discoveries like theirs. The rift had torn them apart, and they hadn't spoken since. But the email was short, cryptic. It simply read that watching you, Clara. Be careful. Don't trust anyone, not even me. The words sent a shiver down her spine. It was a warning, but it was also a puzzle. Who was they? And why was Lyle reaching out now after all these years of silence? Was he trying to help her, or was this just another part of whatever game was being played? Clara stood there for a long moment, staring at the screen, her thoughts racing. She had always known that academia had its dark side, that ambition could drive people to do terrible things. But this was something else entirely. She couldn't ignore the possibility that Lyle had his own reasons for sending the email. Maybe he knew more than he was letting on, or maybe he was in deeper than she realized. But trusting him now, after everything, that wasn't something she could do lightly. She shook her head, forcing herself to focus. There were too many questions, too many uncertainties for her to get lost in the past. She had to keep moving forward, had to stay one step ahead of whatever was closing in on her. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. This time, it was a call. The name on the screen made her heart skip a beat. Detective James Harlow. Dr. Washington, he said, his voice low and serious. I've been thinking about what you said earlier about the message. You're right. Something's not adding up. I've been looking into your case, and there's more to this than I first thought. You're not just a victim of a misunderstanding. There's a bigger picture here. Clara felt a rush of relief mixed with a tinge of suspicion. She had hoped that Harlow would dig deeper, that he would see beyond the surface of this case and uncover what lay beneath. But she didn't know him well enough to trust him completely. She had to tread carefully. What do you mean? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. I've been talking to some people, Harlow continued, and there are rumors. Things that don't quite add up. You weren't the first person to have a run-in with Judge Rowe. There are whispers about his connections to some powerful organizations, ones that don't like questions being asked about certain things. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of organizations? I'm still looking into it, Harlow said, his voice tightening with uncertainty. But I'm telling you, there's something bigger at play here. I've seen cases like yours before, but this one feels different. Whoever is behind it, they're pulling strings, and you're not the only one being targeted. Clara's pulse quickened. Her instincts were screaming at her to be careful. The more she learned, the more questions she had, and the fewer answers seemed to be within reach. What should I do? She asked, her mind working through the possibilities. Keep your head down, Harlow advised. Lay low for a while. Don't trust anyone who comes to you with answers too quickly. And whatever you do, don't go digging into Judge Rowe's past alone. There are people who will try to stop you, and they won't hesitate to make sure you don't uncover whatever it is they're hiding. Clara didn't answer right away. There was so much at stake now. Her research, her career, and perhaps even her life. The tension was building, and she could feel the weight of every word, every decision she made. After a long silence, she finally spoke. I won't stop. I'll find out who's behind this, and I'll make sure they can't get away with it. I don't doubt you, Harlow replied quietly, but just be careful. There's more going on here than anyone realizes. The call ended, and Clara was left standing in the middle of the street, her mind racing. Every conversation, every step she took, only seemed to raise more questions. The deeper she went, the more the threads of the conspiracy seemed to multiply, tangling around her like an intricate web. And yet, despite the growing fear in her chest, Clara felt a sense of resolve. She had spent her life uncovering the past, revealing truths that had been hidden for centuries. Now it seemed the truth was going to find her. But would it set her free? Or would it drag her under, pulling her into a darkness that she wasn't sure she could escape? The days that followed were a blur of quiet tension and increasingly odd encounters. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were constantly on her, even when she was alone. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something, and every unfamiliar face seemed to be watching her every move. It wasn't paranoia. She had long learned to trust her instincts, and they were telling her something wasn't right. She had tried to lay low, as Detective Harlow suggested. That wasn't an easy task when every step she took seemed to draw her closer to the truth. People began avoiding her at work. Colleagues she once trusted turning cold whenever she passed by. She noticed the whispers, the furtive glances when she entered rooms. It felt like she was being slowly pushed to the edges of her own life, as though the world around her was closing in. But Clara couldn't stop herself from digging. It was in her nature, in the blood of every anthropologist, to search for patterns, to uncover what others would rather leave hidden. She had spent days combing through old reports, following every thread, no matter how thin it seemed. But every time she thought she was getting closer, another wall would rise in front of her. An old case file gone missing, a document that had been removed from the archives, a phone call from an unknown number that ended the moment she answered. There was something about Judge Rowe that she couldn't shake. She kept coming back to him, to his smug demeanor, his seemingly innocent dismissal of her in the courtroom. Why had he been so determined to find her? Why had he so eagerly dismissed her expertise and authority? And why, above all, did it feel like he knew something she didn't? It wasn't until she received another email from Dr. Benjamin Lyle that things started to feel more ominous. This time, it was more direct. They're getting closer. I don't know who they are, but I can tell they're watching. Don't trust anyone, especially Rowe. He's too involved. I'll be in touch. The message was brief, but it was enough to confirm the gnawing fear Clara had been trying to ignore. Someone was after her. Someone powerful. And they weren't going to stop until they had silenced her, one way or another. She spent hours trying to piece together everything she had learned, but the more she dug, the more the answers slipped through her fingers. The connections between Rowe, certain organizations, and even some of her colleagues in the anthropology community were beginning to form, but they were still fragmented, incomplete. Whoever was behind this had done a good job of covering their tracks, leaving just enough for Clara to keep chasing, but never enough for her to get a clear view of the full picture. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of sifting through documents, Clara stepped out of her office to find the hallway of her apartment building unusually quiet. She paused, hearing a faint sound, footsteps, quick, deliberate. Someone was nearby. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned the corner, half expecting to see someone standing there waiting. Nothing. She breathed a sigh of relief, though it didn't last long. The unease gnawing at her stomach refused to subside. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was lurking just out of sight, watching her every step. As she reached the door to her apartment, she hesitated before opening it. There was something wrong. It was a gut feeling, but it was strong. With a deep breath, Clara unlocked the door and stepped inside, locking it behind her. She moved quickly, closing the curtains, checking the locks on the windows. But even as she did so, her mind raced. The sense of danger, of being pursued, was overwhelming. She settled into her chair, the harsh light of her desk lamp casting shadows over the room. Her phone buzzed again. It was another message from Harlow. "Clara, listen to me. You need to be careful. I know you think you're getting close, but I've been digging. I've learned things I'm not sure you're ready to hear. Stay out of it. You have no idea who you're really up against." The words made her heart race. Harlow had been trying to warn her for days, but Clara wasn't about to back down now. Not when she was this close. She was certain of it. The pieces were starting to fall into place. She wasn't just fighting against a corrupt judge or a few bad actors in the system. She was up against something far darker, something embedded deep within the very institutions that were supposed to protect people like her. But as she sat there, staring at the message, a sudden thought hit her. What if Harlow wasn't trying to protect her? What if he was part of it all? What if he had been playing both sides from the beginning, feeding her information while leading her into a trap? He had never explicitly told her to stop investigating, but his words had been filled with an urgency, a fear that suggested he knew exactly what she was up against. Was he trying to protect her, or was he trying to stop her? The more Clara thought about it, the more the pieces didn't fit. She had trusted Harlow, But had he ever been entirely honest with her? Her mind raced as she tried to sift through her memories of their conversations, looking for any small inconsistency, any slip-up that might reveal his true intentions. Had he really been trying to help her, or was he just another cog in the machine that was trying to silence her? And then, just as the thought crossed her mind, a light flickered. A cold shiver ran down her spine, and the air in the room suddenly felt heavier, as if the walls were closing in around her. She jumped to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside her apartment. This time, they were closer. She froze. There was no way she had imagined it. Someone was out there, and they were coming for her. Her eyes darted to the window. No, it was too high up. She couldn't escape that way. The door. It was locked, but she didn't have much time to think. Every instinct screamed at her to move, but she stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. And then the door handle turned. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The shadow of the figure outside pressed against the thin crack between the door and the frame. She knew she had to act fast. Whatever was coming, whatever was at her door, would soon have the answers to all the questions she had been asking. The moment of reckoning was here.